Something really cool happens when you get it that God actually, not just that He's real. I mean, that's kind of cool when that clicks. Oh, God is real. I've heard stories, my parents' faith. Now it's mine. I get that. Something really cool happens though when you actually get it that He loves you. I mean, not just loves you, but actually would take the mess you've made with your life, and He would actually just cover that. He would take that upon Himself and forgive it and wipe it out and completely heal you from that guilt, that shame. There's something cool. And you've heard people express it before and talk about it before. It's like this joy that wells up inside, and you don't know what to do with that joy, and it just turns into, maybe you've heard this before, people saying, I'm on fire for God. And maybe you've been there. I know I was there, being totally on fire for God. I mean, He was everything to me when I was a teenager. That's when I got it. That's my grandma, when I was little, she taught me about Jesus, so it wasn't like I was never a believer, but when I was a teenager, I went through a lot of mess, and I went through a lot of hurt, and I went through a lot of bad decisions, and, frankly, when I got it, it was like, are you kidding me? He doesn't even count that against me. In Christ Jesus, it's wiped clean, I'm free. Grace was just amazing. I know that's cliche because it's the song, but it was. And I felt like I was absolutely on fire for God. And I couldn't help talking about it. I mean, when you're on fire for God, when you're sold out for Him, when He's everything, when you're all in, you can't not talk about Jesus. So every opportunity I had with my buddies, and my buddies were all partiers because that's the background I came out of. And so when I was talking to them, they're like, what's going on with Jeff? What kind of drug is he on, right? And some of them kind of had a faith. A good friend of mine, Tim, he had a faith, only it was really, really weak, and he'd admit that now. Now he loves the Lord, serves the Lord. But back then, it was really weak, and so he'd kind of tolerate that, and he'd let me talk about Jesus, but, only so far, let's not get carried away. But I was on fire for Him, and I remember in the car just driving around just praying to God out loud. Now, this is before cell phones, so, right now, you have an excuse. If you want to pray out loud to God, you just go for it because nobody's even going to bat an eye. Oh, yeah, they're just talking on their cell phone. We didn't have them back then. That guy's crazy. What's he doing? And especially at night, I didn't do it so much during the day, but if I was driving home from my girlfriend's house, from my work, or from a youth event, I would turn up the Christian music on the radio and just sing. And now you got to understand, back then, Christian music was terrible. It really was. Contemporary Christian music was terrible. And I knew it was. I mean, compared to the music I listened to, I'm like, this is a real sacrifice for God, but I love Jesus. So I'd turn the station and listen to it, and I'd sing out because the words were meaningful. And I mean, I'm singing loud and badly in my car, especially at night. Nobody can see me, and just on fire for God. You've been there? Do you know what that's like? It is so cool. And here's the deal. We wish it would just stay, and it'd be just that way all the time. And we know it doesn't. It goes in and out. So here's what I want to do. I want to ask you 3 questions, and I want to ask you these 3 questions because, well, first of all, I don't want to put your fire out, but I do want us to really recognize this whole idea of total surrender, that we can be, I love Jesus and I'm for Jesus, and sometimes that doesn't match up with how we live. You've seen that? If you haven't seen it in the mirror, you've seen it with others, right? So let me ask you these 3 questions. They're not easy questions. They're tough questions, but just be honest with yourself. Nobody's grading you. Nobody's going to see your answers. You just answer them in your head. If you knew God was speaking to you, and I don't want to get weird because, I don't know how God's going to speak, out loud, Jeff. I don't know if that actually has ever happened to me. If it does, I really hope it's Morgan Freeman's voice. I mean, I don't know what kind of voice it's going to be, but that's what I want to hear. God speaks in ways that just blow your mind sometimes. If you are a follower of His, if you love Him, you know that something a friend said just kind of confirms what you'd been thinking. You're like, wow, that's weird. That I was just, and some song on the radio, whoa, how'd that happen? That's just what I needed to hear. So however God speaks to you, if you know it was God that was speaking to you, and He said to you, I want you to move. Now, if you're single, yourself, if you've got a family, your whole family, and I want you to move to a foreign field, and I want you to be a missionary for me. The question for me is this: would you go? Would you go? Second question, if you knew it was God that was speaking to you, and God in the voice that God speaks in, whatever that is, however He speaks to you, and you just knew God was asking you to sacrifice something of yours for a cause bigger than yourself, and He was stretching you. He was asking you to give it away. He was asking you to give till it hurts. He was asking you to give sacrificially. The question is, would you give? Third question. If you knew it was God that was saying, hey, I need you to serve in this area that puts you outside your comfort zone. You just was like, oh man, this keeps coming back, and I don't know what your outside your comfort zone is. But maybe it's standing in front of people teaching a Sunday school class. Maybe it's working in the nursery with diapers, and you're like, ooh, gross, whatever your comfort zone, wherever your comfort zone ends, and you're asked to do it beyond that. The question is, would you sign up? We're talking about total surrender. We're in week 15. We're halfway through. Isn't that amazing? That's wild, isn't it? 10 weeks we spent on how to think like Jesus. We're now in the middle of how to act like Jesus. And Jesus, I believe Jesus was all about total surrender, right? I mean, if you look at His life, He went to the cross for us, but it didn't even begin there. It began in heaven when He stepped off the throne to come down here, to be like us. He left everything to serve us. Jesus models for us total surrender. So each week as we go through this, we talk about a key idea. The key idea today is I dedicate my life to God's purposes. I dedicate my life to God's purposes. That's just total surrender. Now the concept of total surrender is a really cool concept. I'm going to stop living for me, and I'm going to live for God. I'm going to stop making it all about what I want and what I feel, and I'm going to make it about His agenda and what He wants to do with my life. That's really cool. The problem is where we live it out. Because for whatever reason, we can tell people, I follow Jesus. Or we can tell people, I'm a Christian. Christian just means I'm a little Christ. That's how it originated. It was a derogatory term at the Church of Antioch, I believe, and it just stuck because people were like, I don't care if people are making fun of us. You little Christian, you little Christian, you little Christ, you little Christ. They were like, that's appropriate. I want to be just like Him. And that's what we're supposed to do when we say, I'm a Christian. That's what we're supposed to do. I want to be just like Him. I want to model my life after Him. So whether you call yourself a Christian, a follower of Christ, a believer, all of those are great. The problem is when we think this way and when we tell people who we are, what our identity is, what we are often saying is, in the big scope of things, in the big picture, if you look at my life from a distance, I'm His. But when you look up close at my moment-by-moment living, oftentimes people don't see us pointing to Him anymore. Often what they see is just another guy, just another girl living life a day at a time. Total surrender isn't supposed to be about the big picture. It's supposed to be about the day-to-day. Jesus, when He told us to surrender, used the same analogy that He literally surrendered to, the cross. He said, take up your cross and follow me. You want to be a follower of me? You want to be a Christian? You want to be a believer? You take up the cross every single day. The problem with total surrender isn't that we are willing to declare it. The problem is we're not always willing to live it. Total surrender requires day by day, hour by hour, minute by minute, and it's hard, isn't it? I heard in what Julie said, I heard in what Tom said, and I echo it. We don't get there, we're not 100%, we struggle. This isn't easy. But it is to be our desire to live it every single day, to totally surrender every moment, every day. It's hard, but it is where we need to be. Because here's the deal. What does our day look like? Well, it looks like this. It looks like stepping back. It looks like waiting. It looks like not going all the way. It looks like not totally committing. It looks like playing it safe, right? It looks like God, protect my family. God, make sure that my children are safe. God, make sure the finances come in. God, could you please, that person that is bothering me with their problem, could you just make them go away? Or could you just solve their problem, then we don't have to worry about it anymore? Will you put a bubble around my life, God? Because I want to live totally surrendered for you, but today I'd like to live just in this bubble. Total surrender and bubble living do not go together, do they? We've got to be totally His every moment. So there's this letter in the Bible. It's just a letter, but it's a huge letter. It's nothing like I've ever written. And it's been preserved for us. It was written to the church at Rome by Paul, and we call it Romans. And it is a really, really cool letter. Here's how it starts. Therefore. Anytime you see therefore, it means there's a whole lot of stuff that's gone on before that. Think about this. We're in the 12th chapter of Romans. Paul didn't put chapters in his letter. That'd be weird. Chapter 12 of my letter to you. You know, he just was writing and writing and writing. He writes, therefore, basically to say, let me sum up everything I've told you. And if you've read Romans, that's a lot to sum up, isn't it? I mean, there's a ton here. This is like his Magna Carta. This is huge for Paul, this letter, because it gives us such a clear picture of Paul's theology. And what he says up to this point is basically, you have messed up. There's nothing you can do that is right. There's no one righteous. All have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And no matter what you do and what you try, you're never going to be able to give any kind of good work to God because you're already sin-filled. Good thing God stepped in and took care of your sin problem, because the wages of sin is death and you deserve to die, but Jesus died for you so that you can live. There you go. There's Romans all the way up to 12. Therefore, he says, I urge you, I plead with you, brothers, in view of God's mercy. Mercy is a gift you don't deserve. Freedom from the penalty that you do deserve. It is an absolutely beautiful thing. It's basically God's dying love. Literally, God's dying love is written in that line. In view of God's mercy, because God died for you, here's what I want you to do. Offer your bodies, yourselves, as living sacrifices. Now, the Jewish mind would have totally understood a sacrifice because they'd been doing it every single day. When they had messed up with the sin, they had to take an animal and actually bring it to the priest and kill it. And the reason is because God wasn't kidding when He said the wages of sin is death. When you mess up, something has to die. God never wanted His animals to die. It says that God watches over a sparrow. God cares about creation. When He created, He said it was good, and yet something has to die because the wages of sin is death. And so they understood sacrifice. Only Paul's not asking them to sacrifice themselves for their sins. That's not what he's saying at all here. In fact, that wouldn't even make sense, because the Jew knew that they were sin-filled. They were going to offer a sacrifice because of their own sin. How could they be the sacrifice? They're spotted. They're not pure. They're blemished. They're not unblemished. Okay, so that just wouldn't make sense. He must mean something more in line with what Jesus said when Jesus says, take up your cross and follow me, because Jesus has already died for our sins on the cross, rose again, victorious over them. But then He says, I want you, if you're a follower of mine, I want you to sacrifice. I want your life to be about sacrificial living in the same sense I did. Not so that you can save yourselves, but because you've been saved. I want you to sacrifice. And he goes on, he says, I want you to be living sacrifices, holy and pleasing to God. This is your spiritual act of worship. There's nothing greater, Paul says, than just giving yourself, totally surrendering yourself. Nothing greater than that. That's worship to God. That is honoring to God. That is loving God. But what does he mean by that phrase, living sacrifice? Isn't that kind of a strange phrase? Be a living sacrifice. Living sacrifice. We know what a dying sacrifice is. There's dying sacrifices all over the place in the Bible. And not just talking about sheep and goats and doves. I'm talking about people actually laying down their life for the cause that is bigger than themselves. Here's one. You guys remember this, right? Oh, we got to fill this in. Whoops. A living sacrifice is not just willing to die for Jesus, but willing to live for Him. If you're taking notes, there's a couple of blanks there. A living sacrifice is not just willing to die for Jesus, but willing to live for Him. This isn't about I give up myself to you, Lord. If you ever call me to die for you, I will lay down, I'll take the bullet. I will say, yes, I believe in Jesus, but the chances are that's never going to happen, so I don't really need to worry about that. But I believe I probably would die for you, Jesus. A living sacrifice is one who says, today, not someday maybe, but today, I will give myself up for you. I will totally surrender in this moment. So there's this guy named Nebuchadnezzar from a long time ago who built this 90-foot statue. And he asked everybody, after he had his craftsmen build it, now think about a 90-foot statue. This guy was really into himself. He was all about himself. He has said, as soon as the music plays, I want everyone to bow down and worship this statue, and anyone that does not worship this statue will be bound up and thrown into the palace furnace and be burned alive. Well, the music was played. 3 boys didn't bow down. That was found out. They were brought in before the king. The king is furious, gives them another chance. They refuse to bow down to the statue. He has them bound, hand and foot, and thrown into the fire. Only they didn't die. God allowed the wrist restraints to be burned off and the feet restraints burned off. The clothes didn't burn. Their hair didn't burn. When they climbed out of the furnace, they didn't even smell like fire. So here's an example of a dying sacrifice. They didn't die, but they were willing to die for a cause, because as Jewish boys, they knew God said, you shall have no other gods. And they refused to bow to this God. So they were willing to die. So that's a dying sacrifice. But what's a living sacrifice? A dying sacrifice is, if I'm ever called up to it, I'm going to do it. But how many of us are ever going to face the situation in which there's a 90-foot statue built and you're told when the music plays, you better bow down or you're going into the furnace? I would imagine that's a pretty small chance. But what about being asked to follow him? Or in this case, there's a guy that comes up to Jesus and says, I will follow you wherever you go. He's initiating the conversation. Oftentimes, Jesus said, follow me. This man is eager. He doesn't even wait for Jesus to ask. He says, I'll follow you wherever you go. Where do you want to go? I'm going. I'm with you. Right there. Here's what Jesus doesn't say. That is so cool. I'm so glad you said that. I've been waiting all day for somebody to say that. Come on, let's go. I'll buy you Starbucks. He doesn't say that. You know what Jesus says? Jesus replied, looking the man right in the eye, he says, foxes have holes and birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head. I'm sure the guy walked away scratching his head like, didn't he hear what I just said? I said I would go anywhere with you. I mean that, anywhere. You just name it. I'll go. What do birds and foxes have to do? Actually, they have everything to do with it. Because Jesus is saying, look, tonight, I don't even know where I'm going to sleep. There may not be running water. It may be cold. There's not going to be shelter over our head. There's not going to be a place for your pillow. We don't even know if we're going to get a meal. What's he saying? He's saying, if you want to follow me, be prepared to get uncomfortable. A living sacrifice goes without comforts. You got to be okay with that. You're going to lose some pleasures if you want to be my disciple. Jesus one time said, if you want to follow me, you better count the cost. This is serious stuff. You better count the cost. Let me ask you, have you given up something for Jesus? And I don't mean like something a long time ago. I mean, have you given up something today to be here? Remember, this is a day by day, hour by hour. Have you given up something to be here? Maybe more sleep. Maybe there was a place you could have gone today, but you decided to go here. Maybe you've got a hobby you love to do, and today's a beautiful day to do it. A living sacrifice gives up something. Have you given up something for your spouse lately? For your wife? For your husband? I know you've given up something for your kids because it's school time. You've given up a lot of money buying them school supplies, but have you given up something for God lately? I know those are hard questions, but it has to be asked because being a follower of Jesus is a sacrifice. Jesus said it was. It's going to cost you something. Well, we know what a dying sacrifice is, right? Right? Just a few years later, and not even that many miles away from Nebuchadnezzar in his furnace, there was this queen named Esther, and she was married to the king of Persia, and she had it made, so it seemed. And this king, by the way, was not a bad king. Compared to Nebuchadnezzar, he was actually a really good king. He did make a mistake, though, and the mistake was he listened to his advisor who told him, look, there's these people group, the Jews, they're really bad, let's execute them. Can I have your ring? The king gives him his ring. Go ahead. Jews are bad. Kill them. Here's the problem. Esther, his wife, is a Jew. You think you would have asked that when you were dating? I have to admit that there might have been in my history in the past a time in which I forgot momentarily a specific date on the calendar that was very significant to my wife and I. But I think executing your wife and family and all of her nationality is probably worse than that. I feel a lot better about myself now. Esther then is approached and said, you got to go to the king and you've got to tell him that he made a terrible mistake and reverse this thing. And she's scared because he's been preoccupied lately and she hadn't even seen him in a while. And she knows that there's this law of the Medes and the Persians that if she goes before the king that he could execute her. In fact, unless he does something to intervene, she will be executed approaching him. And yet she tells okay, just pray and fast and I'll go in and I'll approach him and if I die, I die. And she goes in, and fortunately, he's in a good mood and happy to see her, and so she can plead her case. But she's only able to plead that case because she was willing to risk it all. That's a dying sacrifice, but I doubt any of us are going to be called to do that. What's a living sacrifice? Well, Jesus one time told this story of another king, a king who had subjects that we kind of know this as the story of the sheep and the goats because half of the kingdom was sheep, half of them were goats, and he says to the sheep, the ones that did well, he said, look, I want to bless you. And the reason I want to bless you is because you took care of me and you fed me and you clothed me and you visited me and you bandaged my wounds. And they're like, oh, that's awesome. You want to bless us? Cool. But wait, we're confused. We don't remember any of that. When did we do that? And so they ask, Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you or thirsty and give you something to drink? When did we see you a stranger and invite you in, needing clothes and clothe you? Lord, when did we see you sick or in prison and go visit you? We don't remember any of this. The king will reply, I tell you the truth. Whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers of mine, you did for me. He's saying, look, I love my subjects. I love my people. And if you take care of them and you take care of the poor and you take care of the hungry, you take care of them, I am being taken care of because they're one and the same. I love my people. And Jesus is saying the same thing to us. You serve people and you take care of people and you help people. You're serving me. And that's done on a daily basis, right? Because we see need all around us. And so to be a living sacrifice, it means to serve others' needs. So the question is, who have you fed recently? Who have you helped out recently? When was the last time you stopped and listened to that individual who's really hurting? I mean, really listened, was there for them. Not to give advice or to fix their problem, just to be there to bandage their emotional wounds. Maybe it really is a literal hospital visit. Or some of us here actually do prison ministry. When was the last time you actually wrote to somebody who was incarcerated? When did you do these things? Jesus would ask. That's a living sacrifice. Okay, so we know what a dying sacrifice is, right? In the New Testament, there's this guy named Stephen, and Stephen was an outstanding citizen, loved Jesus, wanted so badly to share the good news that Jesus had saved his life. He was actually filled with the Spirit and doing miraculous works, and people were amazed. But the religious leaders, a group of people who hated Jesus, hated this guy, and found a reason to arrest him and had him stand trial in front of the Sanhedrin, the very court. He actually stood in the center of the Sanhedrin court, in the spot Jesus stood on trial. And he was accused just like Jesus was. Because Stephen was an upstanding, righteous man, they had to bring in false witnesses to accuse him, just like they did Jesus. And yet, while they're accusing him, they notice and are astounded because his face begins to glow like that of an angel. Nevertheless, they drug him out of there and stoned him. Sometimes a dying sacrifice actually dies. There are martyrs for Jesus in the world. And who knows what's going to happen in our history, in our country? Who knows what's coming? Maybe that's what we're called to, but right now, we need to live as a living sacrifice. What is that? Paul tells us, look, I consider my life worth nothing to me. I've given up comforts. He says, if only I may finish the race and complete the task the Lord has given me. He's living for others. The task of testifying to the gospel of God's grace. You see, Paul believes that a living sacrifice risks it to talk about Jesus, and sometimes we don't think that's part of the deal. I will give up comfort and I will serve, maybe, but talking about Jesus, and yet Paul says, no, we have got to be people who are willing to share why our life is different. We're a light in this world. We can't hide it. We're salt. We can't not use it. We are here to make a difference. And so the question is, when was the last time you talked to somebody about Jesus? A coworker, a friend, extended family. When was the last time you shared Jesus can help you? You realize that talking about Jesus doesn't mean you have to have all the answers. It just means that you have to have a testimony. You know what a testimony is? Basically, I was broken. I was lost. I was hurting. This is what Jesus did. That's it. That's what it means to witness. You're not witnessing because you were there. You're witnessing because God is here. And this is what He has done in your life. You're a witness to that. You don't have to have Bible answers. You have to have God working in your life. Have you shared Jesus lately? Total surrender is not a someday maybe. It's a here and now, everyday thing. And we need to figure out a way to wake up in the morning and give ourselves to God each and every day. So I'm going to ask that you do something. You can consider this. You don't have to do it, but God bless you. I'm going to ask that you do something. Tomorrow morning when you wake up, I don't know if you're a morning person with your prayers or not, but the first thing, before you get out of bed, just, first of all, say good morning, Lord. He might like that. After all, He brought the sun up. That's pretty cool. Say to God, God, how do you want to use me today? That's a real simple statement. Be prepared, because it might mean you get uncomfortable and might have to serve, and you may be in a situation where you have to tell others about Jesus. Let God do a little directing, though. Let Him be the orchestrator of your day. Jesus, how do you want to use me today? What can I do? Simple question. As we close, I just want to share with you that Jesus Himself was both a living sacrifice and a dying sacrifice. And you think about it, He came down to heaven, He lived a life that He didn't even know where He was going to lay His head. He lived His life of sacrifice for us. He lived a life of denial of things that we probably wouldn't have even thought would have been, morally bad for Him to do, but He just denied a lot of the pleasures of this world so that He could serve us, and He certainly denied sin and temptation itself so He could be the sacrifice. So not only is He a living sacrifice, but He died for us. He's a dying sacrifice. The good news is He didn't stay dead, but rose again. It's as if He came out of the fiery furnace untouched by the flame, or that He walked out of the king's inner courtroom alive, or literally got up from the stoned pile of Stephen alive. Well, what literally happened is He was buried in a tomb. 3 days later, He got up and He walked out alive, conquering your death that you deserve. He took your place. He is your ultimate dying sacrifice. And if you've never placed your life in Him, I invite you to come and do that. If you've never surrendered to Him, I invite you to surrender. If you've never been baptized and laid yourself down, what an act of dying, right? Romans 6 tells us, don't you know that you have been buried with Christ and then raised with Christ? Baptism is a dying and rebirth, dramatization, identifying in the very work that Jesus did on the cross to save you, dying and raising from the dead. Whatever your decision is today, whatever you need, you just step out of your row and you come. We're going to stand. If you'll stand with me, we're going to sing a song right after this prayer. This is your turn to make a decision. Father God, we love you and thank you for our living sacrifice, Jesus Christ. He lived the life we could not live. Our dying sacrifice, Jesus Christ, died the death we could not die. Now living again, rose from the grave, victorious over our death, so we too may live. For those that have not yet surrendered, I pray that you will stir their hearts and move them forward to give themselves fully to you. Father, may this be a morning of rebirth and renewal. In Jesus' name, amen. Come.